Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, 10 Leadership Strategies for Workplace Mental Health, presented by Scott Moore and Jeff Dill. Before I hand it over to Scott and Jeff to introduce themselves, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. So today's webinar is being recorded, and both the link to the presentation and the PowerPoint slides will be made available in the AAA store tomorrow. So feel free to download that if you want to reference the slides or the recording or share it with anybody else at your organization. If you have any questions throughout today's presentation, please post them in that Q&A section on your menu, and we'll try to get to them throughout today's webinar, or we will address them at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Scott to get you guys started.
Thanks, Meg. Appreciate it, and want to thank all of you for joining us here for this really mental health-based webinar, sort of in keeping with, for those of you who attended prior office hours, where Dr. Lau Morrison and I sort of had discussions around mental health and wellness. Just before we get started, wanted to remind you all that coming up here in April is the AAA's annual conference and trade show. If you haven't already done so, you should register. So far, turnout has been at a record high level. But I do know that the room block is filling up there at the Gaylord, that enormous Gaylord in Nashville. But be sure to come out and join us. And if you haven't already done so, just go ahead and get registered sooner rather than later. So many of you know me. My name is Scott Moore. I am the AAA's HR and Operations Consultant, and I am joined today by Jeff Dill. Jeff is the founder of the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance. I will, Jeff, for those of you who don't know Jeff, Jeff has done prior webinars with us. Jeff is a longtime EMS guy. I will let him introduce himself. But just for those of you who don't know, Jeff is the one who supports the AAA in helping find counselors and mental health resources for AAA member organizations and AAA member employees. So I will, Jeff, do you want to go ahead and just give a little brief background on you?
I will. Good morning, everyone from Las Vegas. And yes, it's nice to be in Las Vegas. There's no doubt about it. Never thought we'd retire here, but you know, life takes you different places. As Scott said, I started my fire EMS career back in 1990 in the Chicagoland area. Became a licensed counselor when I was a battalion chief, and moved into creating, developing Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance in 2010. To take care of our fire EMS and dispatchers. And that's when we started tracking the unfortunate events of suicides for first responders. And I'm currently the behavioral health administrator for Las Vegas Fire and Rescue. Yes, we have helped over the last couple of years, helped untold over hundreds of AAA members looking for counselors. I vet them, I pair them up to get them some help, and you can see Scott has put up the request, and I've met a lot of our brothers and sisters in the EMS world, getting them help. It's a true honor.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to add is, prior to the AAA's work with the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance and Jeff, we had an EAP, and Jeff's not an EAP per se. What Jeff does is helps link our members with those resources that have a background or experience with dealing with first responders and EMS and fire. So it's important, because previous to that, we did have some resources, but sometimes those resources were, you know, they were connecting our members with folks who really didn't have a background in EMS. And for those of you who've worked in EMS for a length of time, you probably recognize how much easier and more meaningful it would be to work with mental health professional who has experience with folks who do what we do. So this is one of those resources that actually gets used a fair amount. But what I would suggest is one of the things that Jeff and I also, just in full disclosure, the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance and the Code Green campaign, I'm a board member on the Code Green campaign. We are, as these two organizations, really with a very, very similar mission, are now working together in many, many ways to try and further our efforts for mental health and wellness, and trying to get resources and make sure that we're supporting EMS and other public safety providers. So I've been grateful to get to know Jeff and to work with him and Karen at the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance. And I'm also grateful for you taking the time today to come on. It's interesting. We did a webinar last week on the OSHA regulations that actually mention Jeff and the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance in the new OSHA regs. Last week's OSHA webinar had over or nearly 160 people on that webinar, and I know it's been viewed a bunch of times since then. And there is an enormous component tied around both physical and psychological or behavioral health. And, I'm confident that we will be working with Jeff as we're trying to put together resources, and as those regulations work their way through the rulemaking process. I'm confident that I'm going to be tapping Jeff to try and assist with getting resources together to make sure that if and when or whatever those final rules look like, that we're able to support AAA members for compliance. So, but just less so on the compliance part, but more on the human part. This is one of those things that workforce and EMS has been a major, major challenge. Both, frankly, the challenge is no different today than it was 5 years, 6 years ago when we first started measuring turnover in EMS. But what I will say is the environment with which we're operating in is incredibly different. During my discussions with Jeff in preparation for this webinar, one of the things that we realized, I'd mentioned that I had had 3 of my past colleagues die by suicide, really within a relatively short period of time. And one of the things Jeff said was, well, did you report those to us? And I said, gosh, I don't think I did. So after the call, I sent those 3 names in. He had 2, but did not have 1, right? And so what I'm confident is that there are probably more people than we want to count that we never learn about. So what we would ask is spread the word, certainly, if in fact you hear of unfortunate incidents of a first responder or an EMS firefighter or other public safety official dying by suicide, please notify Jeff and or us. We'll make sure we get the information. Today's session, again, is intended to be a discussion session. Now, for any of you who are online here, certainly we'll be watching the chat. And so what we would ask is, if you have questions, we would prefer to have a dialogue rather than a monologue. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about as we were sort of planning or prepping for this was, we wanted to just sort of, there are sort of almost no really bad suggestions when it comes to mental health. What we're hoping to do is to focus EMS leaders on the fact that, I know when I took my class back in '89, there was, I think, 1 chapter or maybe even like half a chapter on, the mental health of EMS workers. And I think one of the things that we are trying to get people shifted towards is the concept or idea that the mental health pressures in this environment are ever present, no differently than if you worked in an environment where it was 20 below zero. You have to address and deal with those temperature related issues. What we're saying is, you need to stop thinking about mental health as a one singular event that occurs. There are, in fact, what a lot of the research shows is that it is often an accumulation of a bunch of things that may or may not have been specific traumatic events that actually sort of cause issues or any of the mental health challenges that we see in EMS. So one of the things that we said was, this isn't the 10 items that we're going to talk through today are not necessarily an exclusive list. In fact, there are thousands of things that we could talk about, but we just wanted to focus on a few, and I'm hopeful that I may be able to convince Jeff to come back again and donate his time, as he does so much so already. So one of the first things that we talked about, and I'm going to let Jeff talk here because I'm not the person you really want to hear from, is this idea that it's very, very challenging to be able to monitor mental health and wellness, or even physical health and wellness of your staff if you don't know your team members. So, Jeff, as we were talking about this, I'd love your thoughts on how critical it is that you really get to know your team beyond just a hi, how are you kind of thing.
Well, it's been our history within the first responder world that you had ranks, and ranks were dedicated to certain, obligations, job descriptions. But as time has evolved, we're starting to see that those ranks are still applicable when it comes to discipline and things. But we also now know that our officers and our ranked members, they really need to get involved with the personnel of their people that they're supervising to understand what's going on in their world, to understand their traits, their traditions, to also understand their behavioral health issues and what's going on both on the job and off the job. It doesn't mean that you have to be Mrs. Gladys Kravitz from the Bewitch era, where you're always looking out the window and wondering what's going on with your next door neighbor. But it does mean that you have to learn how to talk, but more than that, you have to learn how to listen to your people and understand what's challenging them in their lives. And by breaking that down, by learning and listening, they're able now to start feel comfortable to come to you. And I'm a firm believer that most of us in the first responder world have a touch of OCD because everything is regulated. It's this is how we do our calls, this is how we do our cleaning, this is how we do our training, and it becomes regulated. And we lose that interpersonal skill in that aspect because behavioral health is really started coming to the forefront, and it wasn't like that in 2010. I tell you, it was. We got beat up pretty bad when we started talking about PTS and suicide and depression, but it's come a long ways now. And one of the things that we need as officers is to understand each other. One of the things we need as workers is to understand each other, and that's important. One of the aspects that we really follow within an organization is the harassment and the bullying that goes on within organizations. And yes, it's okay to have a good time and have some fun, but we have to also understand that we can't cross a line with our people, whether if that it means mocking out any type of trait that they might have, any type of gender, any type of religious beliefs, or any type of behavioral health issues they might be dealing with. And this is where it's important for leaders to know their people, to understand who's being affected by this. And if they are, they can come to you and have that comfort in knowing that you will help them find the resources, provide for them as well as their families.
Well, one of the things that I remember when I was in a senior executive position at an ambulance service, I used to always cut through the employee, the day room or the watch room or wherever, and I would cut through and I would say hello, and sort of in my head that was people's opportunity. And I remember one day as I said, "Hey, how's it going?" and one of the guys said, "Well, if you're not actually ever going to stop to listen to the answer, what the heck did you ask the question for?" And I locked it up and I sat down and I was like, you know what? You're so right, right? So not only, getting to know people, but getting beyond, and we have a slide about this idea of being genuine somewhere that, in a couple of
Right.
in a couple of slides. But one of the things that I would say is you have to sit down, get to know your folks, because, like even some of the data that you shared with me, right? That if you don't get to know your folks beyond the fact that, so and so always likes to work this truck or always works this shift or, is always like, you don't actually start to understand what may be going on in their life, where they are in their life journey, and sort of what drew them to EMS. Because if someone comes in super hyper hopeful that they're going to quote save lives all the time, right? You can find them getting into some mental health or finding sort of some friction there. And so you shared a bunch of data with me that I thought there were a few of these things that didn't terribly surprise me, but then there was one that literally blew me away. I did not expect it at all. So would you mind sort of talking through some of the data that you guys have relative to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me preface that by saying we have validated 2006 fire, EMS, and dispatcher suicides. The highest portion is about 1,600 and something of firefighters. Only 314 are EMS out of our data, which goes to the point that we are missing a lot of information on our brothers and sisters in the EMS world. And what do we do with that data? Well, first off, we try to look for trends. What are the main reasons why our brothers and sisters are killing themselves? Secondly, and that is we want to take care of the families. We pair families together. We hold annual weekend retreats. We do a lot for family survivors. But third, and most important, I think, is we want to remember our brothers and sisters. And I tell people, I've traveled over 1,000,000 miles over the last 10 years speaking, presenting workshops, is that when you look at our data, and you see it everywhere in Congress and media, understand that these are not numbers. These are the faces and the names of our brothers and sisters and the families they left behind. We need to honor them and understand that. And yet, when we look at some of the data, we estimate about a 65% reporting to us. When we first started, it came in through on our webpage at ffbha.org, confidential reporting system. We still have it. When people submit it, I have no idea where the information comes from. What I do then is I contact the EMS organization or fire department and explain to the chief or supervisors who we are and what we do. And I've had 100% because, like I said, we are very confidential. We don't use names. We don't use organizations. As you can see the data here, this is what we show to media and things. If you do see families, it's because they've allowed us to use names, hoping to educate others on the loss of their loved ones. But when there's a couple terms I want to throw out at you, and one of them is called cultural brainwashing. It was a term I coined way back in 2011. And cultural brainwashing is very simple. You put this uniform on, this is how you're supposed to act, right? Professional, brave, strong, courageous, courteous, self-sacrificing. And we see that in the EMS and fire first responder world. That's who we are. And who expects us to act that way? Well, our brothers and sisters we work with, the communities we serve, the traditions of the EMS world tell us this is how we're supposed to act. So when I start looking at our data, and one thing I will tell you, our data, we can absorb, we take so much out of it. There's no discrimination. It doesn't matter if it's fire, EMS, dispatchers. It does not matter if it's career volunteer, city, suburban, rural, male, female, ages, ranks. It just doesn't care. So every organization needs to be prepared with a complete, what I call a complete behavioral health program. And we'll discuss that a little bit later. But the other thing that really sticks out, and I think this is where Scott was alluding to, is when you look at the methods, we know in society that firearms is the #1 method for males, and for females, it's overdose. But when we look at our data, the #1 method for both male and females is firearms. And for females, almost by a 2-to-1 method. And it just makes me think, is it that cultural brainwashing where, especially in the first responder world, it's a male dominant career as well as volunteers, that not only do they maybe see these calls and they know they're 99.9999% effective, the method of taking your lives with a firearm, or is it because they fall prey to the cultural brainwashing of how they're supposed to act in a male dominant career, that not only do they work that way, but they die that way. And so I can't prove it either way. All I know is I have the data. And so these are the things that we look at. And yes, 65%. And I know I always tell people when I show our data, it's not my intent to upset people. I don't know if I'm speaking in front of 20 or 900 who's been affected by suicide, both in their professional or personal life. But yes, if EMS, if you know of any of our brothers and sisters, and believe me, our earliest one is 1877. not a lot of people around from 1877, but out of the 2006, I have personally spoken to approximately 1,960 chief officers and supervisors. I've heard a lot of stories. I've heard a lot of methods, a lot of reasons, and we take all this and we use it to develop our workshops. So, and then the last thing I want to mention before you move on, Scott, is if you could put on your calendar, and you'll see it on our Facebook, May 17th. It's a Friday night. It's always the third Friday of every May for the last 9 years. This will be our 10th anniversary. We hold a nationwide We Remember night where we ask organizations, fire, EMS, and dispatchers to have candles, but for fire and EMS, pull your rigs out, run your lights for 1 minute at 9 o'clock local time to tell the families that we remember their loved ones. We remember our brothers and sisters. They will not be forgotten. It's called We Remember. It's a nationwide event. We get thousands of organizations across the US and Canada that get involved in that. So please join us on that May 17th, 9 o'clock, your time specific. We'll be in Norfolk, Virginia this year for our 10th annual.
Well, and also, I think one of the things that would be wonderful, Jeff, and I don't know, is, highlighting or talking or promoting, in fact, even the May 17th event, right? If you can sort of, take a video, post a quick reel or a TikTok or whatever, it does not matter, right? The goal, I think one of the things are when you started FFBHA back in 2010, right? I remember when I started in the EMS in the early 90s, that, in fact, when we talked about burnout, everyone said it was a load of garbage, that you should just quit the job and move on and go do something else. And so, I know, and in particular in a post-COVID world, and, one of the things the OSHA regs, even focuses on is the fact that we are losing a ton of providers. And for every single one of those, as you said, there's a family related to that this is one of those things that it's not that we're trying to, quote, normalize it, but what we are trying to do is make it part of the regular and ongoing dialogue. So when we look at data like this, right, what we can tell is that the majority of the folks are, one, dying by firearm, number two, are active and are in their sort of what we presume to be in that sort of 20 to 50-year-old category, right? So recognizing, in fact, that sort of those are the median years, right, of your EMS providers, right? They're in there usually 2 to 3 years probably. And I would bet if we broke it down even more and did it by years of service, that we would probably find some interesting correlations there. But, taking a look at, and understanding who you have. A lot of times when I ask people, what's the average or the median age of the folks working at your organization? How many years of experience do they have? A lot of times people sort of kind of know, but they're guessing. And when we come back to getting to know who you have that works at your organization, what we mean is you need to be measuring and looking at the data so that you can understand what the risk factors are for your folks. You can understand, sort of who might sort of be in the right category of people. And so that you can also, build and develop resources around that. Has to come back to communication and communicating what resources are available.
Well, one of the charts that I did not put up there, and that is the known reasons. The known reasons why our brothers and sisters are killing themselves. And number one is unknown. The chief officers, they just didn't know why their members were taking their lives. But the number one known reason by far was relationships. And that's both personal or professional on the job. Relationships followed by depression and then post-traumatic stress. And then there were several others. You have addictions, you have mental health, you have physical health, you have financial issues, and then there was, of course, a lot of combinations of all those. So until we can just stop focusing on post-traumatic stress and understand that our people go through the dynamics of a lot of things called life. And that's what brought us to moral injury. And moral injury is what I'm a firm believer. We put a white paper out last year on it, and you can download it for free off our webpage. I'm a firm believer moral injury plays a larger role than post-traumatic stress in our brothers and sisters. So it's we're learning so much because why? Because we're talking about it. We're taking the time to look and see what other avenues are we struggling with within the EMS world, and how what can we do? What resources are provided? And that goes back to we'll talk a little bit more about the peer support and the culturally competent counselors coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing you actually used a term that I thought was a really great term was behavioral fitness. And this idea that like kind of like I think it was you who used the term of physical fitness, but also thinking about behavioral fitness. And so we're gonna get to the resources and the peer support stuff, but you keyed this term too, right?
Mhm.
Is we often
Yeah,
talk about scene size up, and
right.
you have this term internal size up. Can you chat a little bit about that?
I did. I was on a call, and as a captain, someone said, "Hey, Jeff, can you give me a size up?" And I was in the middle of a fire when it dawned on me. You know what? How come we're not doing an internal size up of ourselves? So I named a workshop after it. And internal size up to me is the belief that we as first responders and as human beings, we need to ask ourselves two questions on a daily basis. Why am I acting this way? Why am I feeling this way? And the best thing that we can do for ourselves is to listen to others because they see us better than we will ever see ourselves. My wife and I have been married 43 and a half years. She knows my facial expression, my tone of voice, my body language. She knows when I've had a rough day. And so listening to others, but we also have to start listening to our own selves, our own body when we're not sleeping, when we're starting to show a lot of anger, when we're starting to isolate, stress and anxiety. It's telling us, hey, something's going on. We need to get help. And so be honest with yourself in that aspect. And I preach this to our counselors as well. You might not want to work with first responders. We can be very challenging as a counselor. I have a certain list of communities that I don't work with as a licensed counselor. And so understanding that internal size up, maybe I don't want to work with first responders. But for us in the first responder world, we need to start listening to others. We need to start listening to our bodies. It's telling us, I need help.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, by the way, is that idea when you're teaching. So I have a vision of an orientation program at an ambulance service or an EMS agency or a fire service, where most of the orientation programs I've seen have been really largely or heavily weighted on one, doing the mandatory stuff you got to do, sexual harassment, paperwork, W-2 forms, but then a huge clinical component, right? Which is always interesting to me because these are people who have gone through some certification programs. Often they're people who have worked in other capacities. And you look at an organization like Boston EMS, they make people who are otherwise certified go through another entire certification program so that they can make sure they meet their standard. And I'm like, well, I don't know. When I think about the percentage of time that EMS workers actually do clinical medicine, there's a lot of part of this job that we have not prepared people for. And go ahead. Looks like you're going to say something.
No, and I agree. Our fire academies, our EMS, I remember my EMT paramedic years, even though it was way back in the early 90s, 90 and 92. There was nothing about behavioral health. And we have to bring that reality into it because, as you recall, Scott, I'm sure you do, when we first became EMTs and we started looking at paramedics and they give us books and they show us a degloving or a fish hook in the eye and stuff. And you think, oh, in a book, oh, yeah, yeah, it looks, that's nothing compared to when you start seeing and experiencing those things out in the field. And
Yeah.
when you're starting to talk about behavioral health, how those start building up and you start experiencing stress and anxiety, you start experiencing sleep deprivation, isolation, anger, we're not preparing our people for those things. And we need to have that continuing ed on a yearly, annual basis for our brothers and sisters and make sure that our resources are up to date. Our inpatient facilities, for our brothers and sisters. So all this comes together when we start talking about doing that internal size up. What are we doing internally size up for in our organization? How are we preparing our people? Because it's always been one of our mantras here at FBHA. We want you to have a great career, but we want you to have a better retirement. And what do we do to get our people through that time period and as well as their families?
Well, and I looked at the data that it was on the last slide. The second highest number of folks from active was retired, right? Because they actually didn't know who they were, right? They like in lots of times, like when I started, my EMT class was a little before yours. It was 89, and but when I started in 1990, um, sort of when we talked about, an idea of retiring, like that wasn't at least in the private EMS world, there was no quote retirement. You just plan, one, you were in your 20s, so the thought of ever being old enough to retire is sort of out of your head. Anyways, but just coming back to this internal size up thing is, my feeling is in an orientation program is that orientation program, virtually every module of the program has to have something tied to behavioral fitness or health. As you know, you've said, I just think, right, the more that we're talking about this concept or idea of it is ever present, right? And if in fact, let's say 20% of the job is clinical, well then, even though I know those 20% are really important, right? We talk about Mayday, Mayday, right? We train Mayday in the fire service all the time. Thankfully, hopefully it never happens. We also, in my fire department, trained how to draft water off of a river. Do you know how many times in 18 years of firefighting I drafted water in an emergency situation? Never, right? And so when I think about what it is that we should probably be focusing our time and efforts on and continuing education and discussions and orientation and field training, right? Making sure you have the right people in field training positions, making sure you have the right people in leadership roles, right? And making sure that they understand their obligation, because I do agree. You mentioned something sort of about following a cultural brainwashing or a script. This comes back to this next point, right? About being genuine, because one of the things that I bet you, if we took a look at some of that suicide data, you'd find that a fair number of those people were in leadership roles, right? And
Correct.
yeah, and so there's this expectation, right, that you'll be some leader role that maybe it's not aligned with who you are. And so can you chat a little bit about when we were talking about this idea of being genuine and why it is so critical for the team's health?
It's when we first started doing workshops, we had two themes, and that was be direct and challenge with compassion. And understanding, your people when you're listening to them or talking to them. But I want to allude real quick what you talked about, leaderships and management. Understand, most of us, well, I'm probably the oldest one here, but most of us with management, we didn't have the ability to learn about behavioral health like the younger um, starting EMTs and paramedics. They're starting to hear more about behavioral health in their academies, in their careers. Whereas management, we didn't have that opportunity and that chance. So it's new to us. So, but the issue is now is your chance. Now is your chance within management to make a difference. This is our greatest time to make a difference within our organizations as well as within ourselves. And if we don't, then shame on us, because what will FBHA's data be 5, 10 years from now? And so by being genuine, it goes beyond not only within your own personal, but it means being genuine for your organization, saying you step into our organization. These are the things that we expect you to do. Be an excellent EMT, you're continuing ed, you will be part of the team, you will have that, the camaraderie that it takes, but you're also going to be held accountable for your own behavioral health. And we will provide the resources, we will provide the training, we will provide any inpatient if it comes to that. And that's what, to me, also being genuine is that your management of that organization You're there to take care of your people from day one and into retirement. And how do you prepare for that? So, that challenge with compassion, being direct, that means you're talking to your people. You're opening up your hearts. One night I had a chief call me. He said, Jeff, he said, I'm driving to the scene of one of our firefighters who took their lives. He says, what do I say? And I said, Chief, did you know this firefighter? Yes, I did. I said, well, then speak from your heart. Tell people that this one hurts. No longer can we say we need to be strong and kind of be that brainwashing aspect. We need to let our people know that it's okay to talk about these issues. These are the resources, and you're not going to get penalized for coming forward when you need help in the behavioral health realm.
Yeah, interestingly, and we got a couple questions that I'm gonna present to you in a second here. But when I was the CEO at Armstrong, we our folks, who were primarily a non-emergency service in the north of Boston area, um, we responded to the Boston Marathon bombing, and a lot of our folks who were primarily doing interfacility transports ended up transporting people with some of the toughest injuries that they had ever seen. And in fact, one of the guys that I spoke with said, I had come back from doing a tour in Afghanistan or Iraq. I can't remember. I think it was Afghanistan. He said, I never saw anything like what I saw today, even over there. Now, what I'll tell you is, I called every single or touch base with every single member who responded and worked in dispatch for virtually every week for months, until such time as they either said, Scott, you don't have to call anymore. And I said, are you sure? Are you sure? But it was one of those things that many of them, I was just, hey, checking in on you, want to make sure things are going okay, you're doing all right. And I think my sense was that, one, it gave me I got to know the folks really. What I'd known them kind of, but then I really got to know them. And it wasn't the first call, hey, how you doing? That was a rough call. It was typically the 10th call that they would then start to really open up and chat about it. So just quickly, Andrew, I think I sort of asked this question, but I don't know that we ever answered it, was, geez, I'd be interested to see, Jeff, if your data has anything on years of experience with, incidents of suicide, because sort of the question that he asked is, does the risk of suicide increase with years of service? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, we keep a generalized in our data and notes and comments of the amount of years per member that unfortunately took their lives, and we found out very quickly early on there wasn't really a tied in. Hey, it happens between 10 and 15 years on the job, because we lost a lot of people in the academies. We lost a lot of people on probation.
No.
And so that first year to 5 years and 6 to 10, we did not see any discrimination. And that's
Interesting.
when we knew. That's when we started tracking retirees, because me personally, I was thinking, well, it's going to be these older 51 to
Yeah.
60, and that wasn't the case. We started seeing a lot younger, anywhere between 1 to 10 years. And when we looked at our retirees, out of those 341, 37 of them took their lives, though, within the first week of retirement, both fire and EMS.
Wow.
And so we started making assumptions based on the data that it did not show a discrimination. You didn't
Hmm.
have to be on 22 years and all of a sudden, hey, now all these things are going to be playing out. Is it a part of it? Absolutely, it is. But
That's
because, and
interesting.
you alluded to it earlier, calls are a lot different than when I started in 1990 in the fire and EMS world. There's a lot more anger out there.
Yeah.
There's a lot more mass casualties. And, we're seeing a lot more things. Plus, we're dealing with our own personal relationships. We're dealing with society, what's going on in politics and the government, inflation, and all these things are really hitting home for us in that moral injury aspect that we I alluded to earlier. So no, we did not see a higher rate just because you worked more years.
Yeah, interesting. So you and I chatted about this, I think, briefly. So Gallup, who's been doing research on all kinds of items for decades and decades, they released a book last year that talked about the rise of global unhappiness, right? And interestingly, so they put researchers for the last 15 years, surveyors in every single country on the continent, I mean, on the planet, every single one. And what they found is that, and they said that sort of was shocking, that the number of people reported living their best lives has doubled, but the number of people reported living their worst lives have quadrupled, right? And so one of the things that they say is a huge driving cause is social media and politics. And so as you and I were chatting about this, I said, our staff, our crew needs to be keeping an eye on their folks, because the next 2 years in this next election cycle are going to be absolutely brutal. And you're right. My experience, and when I ask people today, and I get to do a fair amount of presenting, are you encountering a different environment today than you were 10 years ago? And resoundingly, the answer is absolutely, right? Like, it is significantly different. So the other question that we had from Christopher was, he said, I'm sure you get to this, but we live in a really small rural town and have a career paramedic service. My question is, where do we get help when a person needs outside the agency help? In other words, they say they don't have an EAP, but if you're a AAA member, you do have access to services or resources. But basically, the question is, and I get this, if you're in rural, super rural Missouri, I would imagine with telemedicine and all that nowadays, things have become a lot more accessible.
Absolutely. The only good thing I found about with COVID was it opened up telehealth. And so now if I'm here in Las Vegas and I need some help, you know what, I can talk to someone up in Reno through a telehealth, as long as they have my insurance and things like that. Yeah, and we do that. American Ambulance Association members call me and say, and I look and I vet and I say, you know what, I don't really see a culturally competent counselor that I feel comfortable in referring you to. But guess what? There's about 130 miles away. Are you open to telehealth? They take your insurance and they're culturally competent. I would feel comfortable in going to see them. So that's what we're seeing. And I started as a volunteer, and I know rural. I still believe this. It's difficult in the smaller towns because those people you're going on those calls to. And
Right, right.
most of them are a lot of have family relations, so you're working together on those. So it's very challenging and difficult. But no, we that's what we do. We will find you the culturally competent that's hooked up with your insurance, and it might be in different part of your state, but we will find someone for you, and that's important to know. And what we did here in Vegas is I put all our resources on a QR code. So when they open up their QR code, they could see the list of the peer support team members. They can see the list of counselors that I have vetted, the inpatient, the chaplains. And so when you start looking at these smaller communities, you might want to invite counselors or chaplains to do ride time to get to know them. And I tell counselors, I said, create a 1 to 2 minute video bio and send it off to your local fire departments, your smaller towns, to let them know who you are and what services you provide. So there's ways of getting around and helping the smaller rural towns.
Well, and if you have a counselor in your area, as you say, invite them in to visit. Because I know Dr. Russell in Missouri has a counselor in their area that they pay a pretty modest amount of money to spend. Basically, this counselor comes around, I think, on a weekly or monthly basis. And it's gotten to a point where the person's been coming around so much that now it's sort of part of the team. And he says that actually the folks are starting to engage the counselor outside of their association with the counselor inside their building. So I know we're sort of running on time here. Behavioral health guidelines and policies we talked about, right? I'm a lawyer, so SOPs are everything to me. But one of the things that are required in the new OSHA regs, if and what the final version looks like, are that you establish both physical and behavioral health guidelines.
Right.
So can you chat a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I saw this writing on the wall many years ago. Not, I think it's great that organizations and early on they believe, well, you know what? We have an EAP and we have a peer support or SISM
That's all
team.
we have to do, right? Yeah.
And that's what it's so much more. So we started consulting with organizations on creating a behavioral health program, a complete one. For us, it's 12 points. And so every organization, you can take those 12 points and you can make them smaller or fit for your organization. You might not need all 12 points, but they start in your academies, whether it's your EMS, your dispatcher, fire, and it includes your families. It includes your peer support team. It includes counseling. It includes creating guidelines and policies. We all have them for administration. We all have them for on-scene operations. I estimate in all my travels, less than 5% of all EMS and fire organizations have behavioral health guidelines and policies. And we need those in place to assist not only our officers, but also our workers, to let them know this is what's going to happen when you say, I need some help. You go to an officer and say, these are the things that are bothering me. It gives them direction. It gives them confidence in that aspect. And, and part of it, of our 12 point is also, what retirement program are you giving your people? Because when we interviewed 127 recently retired EMS and firefighters, we found out the top three issues were loss of identity, loss of belonging, and lack of purpose. These are humongous, and they play out to moral injury. And moral injury is that where PTSD and is trauma-based, fear-based, moral injury hits our emotions, our ability to feel. Maybe we're not saving enough lives. Maybe I feel guilty about something. And one of the key aspects of moral injury is betrayal. Betrayal by management, betrayal by others, betrayal by ourselves. And so this moral injury, the military has been studying it a lot, and they found that in their data that they lost more soldiers to moral injury than PTSD. And so that's why we did the white paper, and that's why I try to impress upon, those of you who are here today, look out for moral injury in your people, because I believe that that's causing more of our suicides. Why? Because the number one known reason for us is relationship issues. And that speaks to our heart, our emotions. And so having these guidelines and policies is imperative for organizations to have. It's not just having a culturally competent EAP and a peer support team. Those are great. Those are fantastic. But there are other things to do to improve that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think it comes down to, and I don't know, Jeff, one of the things that I know I'm going to have to create following the OSHA regs, if they finalize, will be some sample behavioral health guidelines around that. And we're going to talk more about what are some indicators that might be helpful. But one of the things that you and I were chatting about prior to jumping on here was peer support teams, the good and the bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as head of the peer support team in Vegas, you have to have consistency. You have to have confidentiality. If you have any members break confidentiality of your peer support team, that's done for 10 years, at least 10 years, because that gets around like wildfire. And, when Illinois first created their Illinois peer support team in 2014, two good friends of mine, they went out and they trained over 200 fire and EMS members in the state to be peer support team, response team members. And then it grew and it grew and it grew. And I've been saying for years, be careful. There's some pitfalls here for our peer support team members. Why? Because they are members of the EMS and dispatchers and fire service. And if we don't take care of them, we have to really watch out, because we're going to see unfortunate
support team members struggling, right?
We're going to see, right. And this is what we started seeing in our data in the last couple of years, Scott, was that we started seeing more and more suicides of peer support team members. Oh. So it's incredible. You have to set guidelines and expectations for your team to respond to others, but within those guidelines and expectations, there needs to be something to cover their behavioral health as well. Now, I offer this to you, anyone. I think Maggie put our email address in there. I have guidelines on how to create peer support teams. What we use in Vegas, what I created in Vegas, how to select members. I have these guidelines and policies. If you want them, just send me an email. I will send them to you. It's important that we have these type of things. If you want a chaplain policy, it does me no good to hoard all this information.
Yeah,
I've learned
yeah.
it from all my travels and talking to all our thousands and thousands of brothers and sisters. And peer support teams, they are a vital function of an organization. But we also, like I said, have to learn to take care. One of the things that we put in ours is you're on a peer support team, you will see a counselor once a year. Because not only are you going on those calls and you have issues in your own lives,
Maybe you're
now you're
carrying
listening.
everybody else's stuff too.
Absolutely, Scott.
Yeah,
Absolutely. You're hearing
yeah.
everyone else, and that's overwhelming. There's a difference too. And this is one of the things you have to realize as a peer support team member, whether you're qualified for it in that aspect. There's a difference between having empathy and being an empath. Empathy is, man, I really feel bad for you. I'm going to help you out. An empath is, I feel your pain and now I'm going to live it at home. And you have to know that about yourself. If you're an empath, you should not be on a peer support team. So that's just some of the things.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some, some people there, when you see, you can actually, as to your point about empaths, you can tell they're actually experiencing the pain themselves firsthand rather than simply, not sympathizing is the wrong word, because sympathy often comes across in a negative way, but where you sort of, I feel for you, but there's different than I am actually feeling what you feel. This one is sort of duplicate in a way, but I want to make sure that I distinguish it. I talk a lot about employee engagement and the importance of frontline, the connection between frontline supervisors and leaders. This comes down to not only one, giving your team members opportunities to engage each other, right? Because I think part of what we've seen is in the old days, we might run a bunch of calls, but then we'd all come back and we had what we called group in the city of Lynn. We called it group. It was Monday night group. It was the same group of people that always worked together, and we would sit down at the table in the garage and we would have one big discussion that sort of went on and on and on. And it was what we called group on Mondays. And it was incredibly therapeutic for us. And in fact, when somebody else came in, we brought them into the group. And then frankly, when too many of the group members were missing, it kind of got wonky. I think there is something to that. So ensuring, and if you don't have any idea how often your team members are engaging each other, that's a problem, right? That's one of those KPIs that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But just because of time, I want to keep us moving. This is one that not only is present in the OSHA regulations, right? Is that, hey, you have these behavioral and physical health resources available to folks, but that you are communicating them on a regular basis. And also understand a lot of services, well, we don't have a lot of resources to do this. These can be community-based resources. They can be web-based resources. They can be local chaplains or clergy in your communities. Just here's what I'd say is, and this also leads right into this one that, frankly, I have a lot of folks who will say to me, geez, well, we have an EAP and we have, of course, the Mental Health Parity Act says that the richness of your mental health benefits have to be at least, there can't be any plan limits that are greater or less. You can't provide plan provisions that are less than what you provide for medical provisions in your health plans. But one of the things that Jeff, you and I talked about was look at your plan and make sure that there are counselors and mental health resources in network, right? Because a lot of our folks, if it's not in network and they've got to come out of pocket for it, they're not going to.
And that goes also, and I've seen that a lot of times. Try to find a plan that is local for your area, for your people, so that they can visit those counselors. Not something that maybe if you're out on the East Coast and you get a West Coast plan that a lot of your counselors aren't associated with is key for success for your people. But the other thing that I've started seeing a lot of is that a lot of our counselors now are not taking insurances. And that's a problem as well because they're not getting the payments from the insurances in a due just time. So they're all saying, hey, you know what? It's cash. for that aspect. But if you can find a counselor that will give you a sliding scale for your first responders or some type of HSA, Scott, you know that better than I do.
Yeah, the HSA piece is right is an opportunity for people to put aside a certain amount of money, and employers can match either all on their own. They have an optional match, or they can even fund some just on behalf of the member. That money goes in tax-free, of course, so it's pre-tax dollars. It's also a deduction for the employer. Then the money gets invested like a 401k. So the growth, any growth or earnings in that HSA investment grow tax-free. And then when you use those dollars for medical reasons or for medical expenses, the withdrawal of those funds is a tax-free event, and it's portable, so it goes with you if you change from one employer to another. And then if you don't end up using it, unlike an FSA where you lose the money, if you don't end up using it for medical, and you can use it into retirement and for Medicare, if you don't end up using the money, you can always withdraw the money and you get taxed like a regular 401k. This is one of those things where I say to folks, this is, if you don't like paying Uncle Sam taxes, this is one of those things that is really great. In addition to that, look at the utilization data, right? Oftentimes you can get at least, you'll get de-identified data from your plan, but take a look at the plan to see, is anybody even using your mental health resources or benefits? Because if not, there's two reasons. Your folks are all 100% A-OK. Well, three reasons. They don't, they don't believe that it's worthwhile to use those resources, or the resources don't exist. Right. So if you are not looking, by the way, problem is still there, even if you don't look at it. Right. So that's one of those things that there are multiple ways to determine if the benefits that you're offering are rich enough, multiple ways that don't involve you even asking the EMS team member. You don't even have to. So, and I know we're kind of getting near the end here. We only got a couple minutes left. Key performance indicators are what a lot of people call. Our folks don't like the term key performance indicators. Sounds like big business. So I call them either key personnel indicators, or I call them vital signs. Just like the vital signs for a patient, every organization has vital signs. You should be looking at these data. These data are, how many hours are your people working, right? How many consecutive days have they worked, or consecutive hours have they worked? Are they requesting time off, and are you able to even give them time off? Are people calling out sick or unscheduled call-offs? What's the volume? It is unrealistic. We do not let truck drivers drive more than, I think it's 10 or 11 hours a day. But, and I understand there's an opportunity potentially for rest, but know your own system. If you're working in the city of Lynn, Massachusetts, I got news for you. You are not resting at all for the entire shift, period. It's not going to happen. So looking at your data, beyond just the critical mental health related exposures. My first call was a brutal first call. It was a really brutal first call. Would have ended the careers of a lot of folks, but for me, I just thought this was what they saw every day. And it wasn't until 4 or 5 years later that I realized that wasn't. Right. And then getting people a break or some sort of meal break has an enormous recuperative ability. Right. It's one of those things that if you don't even have any idea how often that's occurring, that is a problem. You need to know.
I just wanted to add, Scott, in that list there, they're all challenging, difficult, but the one that sticks out for me is the sick time, because almost 15% of our data indicated prior to a member taking their life, they were starting to call out sick. And that's where it goes to, you're as an officer, as a leader within your organization, know your people. If you know they're struggling with some type of issue, and all of a sudden you started seeing them calling sick, that's where you have to be very proactive in getting them help.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's one that you told me that, and that one surprised me. This is one that I think is really important, because we oftentimes think about the provider themselves, the team member themselves struggling. But if you talk to any family member of a team of a first responder, firefighter, EMT, they're in this too. By the way, they didn't sign up for it per se, if they're not also actually an employee or a firefighter or an EMS person. Engaging, and I don't know if you want to chat about this, but engaging the family member too. That to me is one of those things that my fire chief used to recognize all the call firefighters every year, and then they would make the family stand up and recognize the families, because again, those folks are sacrificing as well, and they watch the toll that these things take. And so what are, Jeff, I don't know if you have any suggestions on how organizations can support the family as well?
Well, I think it's also important that you have educational workshops for them to understand what their
Oh, good
members are
point.
going through. And I think that's key. And then what recommendations do you have, for those members? We started saying that early on with the data. So, we created a workshop that's just for families so that they can understand and talk to other family members. So creating a branch where other families know each other, they can talk to them and call them in times of trouble is absolutely vital. Just get them involved in all aspects of the behavioral health, but in particular, that if you lose a member to suicide, please do not alienate that family, because it becomes a double loss for them. They
Yeah.
lose not only their loved ones, but then they lose the EMS organization that they had come to know and love and became a part of. So always, please, always remember them and include them. Up to the point where they finally say, "Hey, you know what? I appreciate it, but we're no longer need that." But at that moment, they need you to be by their side.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's one of those, that's a major opportunity, right? Providing resources to them, even giving your team member, hey, here's something you can, tell your family member if they need to talk to us or they want, like you've done a really tough call, maybe saying, hey, and I don't know, there's got to be some resources out there that suggest, here's what's going to likely be happening for your person, maybe even at orientation, your folks have signed on to be an EMT or paramedic, right? Just so you know, sometimes they're going to come home and they're not going to want to talk, right? Or sometimes they just spent, my wife is a primary care physician. My wife has no time to listen to me complain about anything that physically bothers me. She says all my compassion is spent at the office, right? And so that's why they say that, medicine's a jealous mistress. The fact of the matter is one of those things where, you have to know that, like, people say, oh, it's nice you married a doctor. I go, "Hey, yeah, it is. But let me just tell you, we sacrifice as well as a family." So, with that, we
I
are
just
over time. Go ahead, Jeff.
And just one quick thing. I
Yep.
think it's important that we teach each other, members within an organization, with your loved one, your support system at home, is to do a internal size up. Meaning, at the end of the night, you talk to each other, saying,
Yeah,
"What emotions did I show? How did I display it? And how did it affect you and the family?" And that's
that's
how
a
you
great
open up that bonds, that communications for each other for the rest of your life. So.
Yeah, that is a great, great, great suggestion, right? Because it also, right, you're not asking that person to take a hit for the team
Right.
functionally, right? You're sort of including them. So Jeff's contact information is up here, and what I will tell you, if probably the single most valuable resource, in my opinion, in this area in EMS and first responder community. So Jeff, I can't thank you enough, and your organization for all the support that they've given, not only, AAA members, but first responder community. I can't thank all of you enough for logging on to this event. And I'm hopeful, based upon feedback. We didn't get a ton of questions, but I appreciate the questions we did get. In the future, I want to see if maybe we can open this up for an open dialogue where people can actually unmute and have an opportunity to participate. So, Jeff, thank you. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Meg to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff and Scott, for a great presentation. Thank you guys for joining us today. Just as a reminder, today's webinar was recorded. It'll be posted online on the AAA site in the store tomorrow, along with the PowerPoint slides. I did also send the link to the PowerPoint slides in the chat if you want to go ahead and grab those before we close out. And then, as Scott mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to connect you with either Jeff or Scott, or just go over any of the AAA member benefits, especially related to this topic. You can go ahead and email hello@ambulance.org. And with that, thank you guys again, and hope you guys all enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks, Scott, and thanks, Jeff.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Really appreciate it.